Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today, it's that time of year to look back to how things have gone over the last 12 months and to look forward to how things might go over the next 12 months or so. Today's session, we're going to be looking in three areas. But first, let's introduce the presenters. My name is David Dingwall. I'm a cybersecurity strategist at Help Systems. What that means is I'm quite involved in thinking about how systems and services are impacted and how it changes the way people do their jobs. And then my colleague, I'm joined by Bob Erdman, who's one of our security product managers at Help Systems. Bob, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, David. Yes, I am a security product manager here at Help Systems. I work heavily with our development teams on our Linux, Unix, and Windows solutions, and I've been in the industry about 20 years, working with a lot of different verticals from finance to healthcare to government systems.
Okay, so I understand there was a little technical difficulty in the screen showing, but I believe that's all up and running now. Today's session, we are going to be covering three topics rather than just two. We are going to be looking back at the year in review, probably a little different from some other similar presentations. We're going to fill the middle gap with what we call familiar foes, things that have happened in the past that will keep going into next year. And then lastly, we're going to finish off with new trends and predictions of some changes, operational changes, process changes, and some governmental focused changes that are going to impact us all over the next 12 months or so. So let's start with 2018. It's been a very mixed year from a cybersecurity perspective, and there's been a fair amount of disruption on business side, not just technologists and infrastructure people, but on the way people do business. So let me pick up the first topic of the year, certainly impacting international companies of all kinds. And that has been the European Union's GDPR regulations, which went live in Q2 this year. The topic I want to cover just a little is the potential violations and costs going forward. Now, obviously, breaches that were reported in 2018 very probably happened before GDPR went active. But I just wanted to give you a feel for some of these violations that happened this year that were fined under old regulations and how the money impacts, at least, never mind the reputational impacts, are going to change significantly if they were reported and actually happened this calendar year. The first one is Morrisons. Morrison is the #4 retailer in the UK. Their web presence and their supply chain systems are very secure. However, one of their employees walked out the door with customer and supplier and employee information and took that away with him. This was taken to UK court, and the court decided that having the internal systems not protected appropriately was a data protection violation. So therefore, Morrison was fined in the region of 13,500 euros. It's about $13,500. If that similar breach had happened under the new GDPR regulations, then Morrisons would have had to stamp up at least 10 million euros, about $10 million as a minimum fine. Uber in Europe has been fined by the UK and the Netherlands. They had exposed data about their drivers and their end customers. The UK fined them £500,000, and the difference was the Dutch government. There's still some potential fines coming from other European countries as well. So they are having to pay out 1.2 million euros. And under the new GDPR regulations, again, that would have been a minimum of 10 million euros. Uber is still a loss-making company. Fines are related to the turnover of the organization. and Uber would have to stump up at least 10 million euros based on the criteria for the breach that actually happened. Facebook is a significantly different breach tied very much into the national referendum about whether the UK would leave the European Union. And they were fined £500,000, 640,000 euros. Now, this breach was complicated by third parties in extracting information from Facebook systems, and that data being blended with consumer and retail store information, where opt-ins and retail opt-outs were being ignored by the organization Cambridge Analytica, an organization itself which has now gone out of business and is currently being chased for something like £20 million. Facebook itself, its maximum amount it could be fined was £500,000 UK under old regulations. Because of the egregious version of the type of violation here, and because it was stomping on top of people's personal preferences and the data was being misappropriated for other uses, a 4% fine as a minimum, or a minimum of 20 million euros, would hit Facebook quite significantly based on their 2017 worldwide run rate. That would come out at 1.63 billion euros or dollars, a factor significantly higher, almost times 100 compared to the fine they got paid, they got charged with in the UK. As you can imagine, Facebook is challenging this fine in court, not so much that they can't pay the money, but because of the legal precedent that they set when GDPR regulations come on stream and the next violation comes through, then it has a serious impact on their bottom line. Lastly, over the last couple of weeks, the first real violation that really hits under GDPR regulations is the Starwood Hotel and Resort chain. This is part of a larger hotel group, but because Starwood systems and processes really focus on particular brands like the W Hotel Group, the Sheraton, and other suite-based organizations, typically because their systems and processes are isolated from any parent company, their 2% of business exposure worldwide would turn into a 1.5 million euro or dollar exposure just for the European customer base. I think it was 500 million records that were exposed, and say a third of that was EU residents. They would get fined quite severely. That's going to take quite a bit of analysis, and European regulators are still looking at how Starwood is handling this breach. So expect more information through 2019. Bob's going to pick up on malware breaches because there's been a significant move of that through 2018. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, David. In 2018, we did experience numerous breaches in virtually every industry type. Many government entities as well had issues with malware breaches last year. And just going over the largest of them would take a lot more time than we have today. But I'm going to give you some highlights, give everybody a better idea of the types and the ranges of issues that are plaguing us all today. Start off with ransomware. So Samsung ransomware payments are now estimated to be well over $6 million. And the amount of ransomware really shows no signs of letting up. And there's many copycat actors out there now as well. Payment requests range all over the map. Samsung, being a much more targeted group, generally is asking for much bigger payouts in the $10,000 to $50,000 range is not uncommon. And there's lots of other scripted and automated actors out there that generally charge a lot less. But the cost of that ransomware, of course, is not just the ransom. You also have to pay for the internal time, effort, and money to clean up the issues, possible reputation damage. Your cybersecurity insurance is most likely going to go up, etc. So there's a lot of costs related to these breaches as they come out. Multiple restaurant chains last year experienced breaches in their point of sale systems that compromised customer payment data and customer personal data. And that, of course, also usually comes with additional payments along the side, drops in your stock price, loss of your customer brand loyalty, and, of course, forking out dollars to pay for credit monitoring for all of your affected consumers. Point of sale, of course, is not the only issue with the food service industry. Customers using online ordering and loyalty card programs of another big national brand were exposed last year because of poor design and configuration in an externally facing web server. And there were additional brand loyalty card data breaches also in 2018. Healthcare still remains a popular target, and multiple issues occurred throughout the year. A major provider and payment processor paid out a huge sum of money last year in fines and settlements related to confirmed breaches. What's flying much more under the radar that you don't really see in the news is the amount of compromising happening on smaller clinics and affiliated sites. Generally those smaller sites don't have as good a security. It's easier for people to access them. And even though the amount of data is smaller, the amount of overall systems makes these vendors a continual target. And with, of course, the degree of interconnection between the affiliates and their major provider networks, that's also giving people a foothold into these bigger environments. Educational institutions were targeted by both standard malicious actors and even state-sponsored groups. Attackers are looking to steal personal information, research data, or simply computing power from these generally large and very powerful networks. And they're using it for distributed denial of service attacks, coin mining, and lots of other reasons out there. Particularly dangerous, and we see this happening more and more, is attacks targeting our younger school-age children. They're looking for identity theft and personal data, so those youngsters are much less likely to be paying attention to the credit file. Of course, stealing an identity is stealing an identity, and if the easier the identity is to steal, the more valuable it is. So people are targeting high schools, grade schools, and other places to get that data. Government entities are, of course, attractive targets, and people usually assume that just because it says government, they've got better defenses in place, but that's not always true. Humans are still the weak link in the chain, and those government databases and government-sized pocketbooks make them very attractive targets. Everybody probably heard about the big ransomware attack that crippled Atlanta for days earlier in 2018. Other big notable breaches occurred at the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Department of Defense had multiple breaches, both of personnel data, contractor data, and military hardware secrets that were stolen. And there were various other state and local governments and government payment processing systems that were also compromised. And then, of course, retailers continue to leak our personal data. And we all now get to monitor our credit files, change all our passwords, constantly reissue our credit cards. We had issues in department store chains, clothing brands, online marketers, and technology resellers. An especially large amount of data was leaked last year from marketing data harvesting firms. So they're collecting all that stuff that you're doing, they're linking it everywhere, and then they're trying to resell that information. We, of course, had massive data breaches over the last 12 months from multiple firms like that.
Great, thank you, Bob. So let's move into the middle slice of today's session and talk about familiar foes. As I mentioned before, these are things that are with us but not going away, but the flavor and taste of them may morph a little over the next year or so. So let's go back to Bob and go back to talking about malware. So you can talk about some of the trends that are progressing forward.
Thank you, David. So 2019 is looking to be another year of patches, breaches, and malware infections across all of our environments. The average time to detect a breach is slowly tracking downwards, and expectations are that this gradual slide is going to continue as security software vendors continue to improve their defenses. Unfortunately, this is coming from an average of almost 200 days to detect a breach, and then, of course, many more weeks after that to fully contain it. So we do have a long way to go. Most companies are also indicating that they're in need of increased cybersecurity budget dollars to defend against this rising tide of malicious actors, of course, that are constantly attempting to penetrate their networks. We do expect to see in-browser drive-by crypto mining attacks decline in 2019. With the drop of cryptocurrency values, there just is not as much money to be made anymore in this fashion. And what we're seeing is that criminals are increasingly shifting towards website skimming or using malicious code to harvest your credentials, your account information, and other info that people enter into what they assume are clean, legitimate sites. Everybody's been trained to look for that lock. As long as they see the lock in the corner, everything's great. That doesn't always mean it is. It just means it has encryption on the communications. It may just be encrypting to the bad guys. Botnets and the woes of the IoT infections, the Internet of Things, are expected to remain steady, but their methods are starting to change now and get to be much more varied. Additional manners are performing denial of service attacks are rising to the top, and that's making it a lot harder for people to defend against. They're having to constantly change their tools, change their methods, change what they're doing to try and defend against these constant attacks. And then, of course, the use of automation in malware circles means that as soon as anything pops up as an open issue and it gets made public, those attackers are jumping on it, scanning the internet for it, and using it as long as they can before they have to move on to something else. Script kiddie style ransomware like Grand Crab infections are expected to decline more in volume, and what's happening is that they're being replaced by much more targeted attacks at higher value items. People with bigger pocketbooks that can pay out more. So we expect that we're going to see more groups like SamSam that take their time. They slowly surveil, compromise, live off the land inside of these networks and get everything ready. And then when they pounce, they're looking for a really large payoff with these higher net worth individuals, networks, and governments. The cloud, of course, also continues to be a lucrative target for malicious actors. Exposed data, open APIs, and of course the possibility of just stealing your resources to mine crypto coining keeps everybody focused on these different systems. Cloud vendors, for their part, are starting to get the message more. They're offering more options to employ security out of the box. People, of course, have to choose to use those options, and we continue to see people either disregarding them, choosing not to use them out of convenience, or simply having misconfigurations that's exposing data and exposing networks out there on the internet. And then, of course, no list would be complete without talking about phishing. Phishing attacks continue to be a major source of infections, especially inside corporate networks. People are making really huge efforts to mask what they're doing by mimicking logos, mimicking websites, mimicking messaging, and then trying to get employees or targeted individuals with spear phishing to open those malicious emails. So really taking a bit of time to train your employees on what to look for is an important way to help your organization's defense. We see it all the time, the end of the quarter, the end of the month, that sales email comes out that says, hey, I got a problem with this big, huge thing I want to buy from you. And of course, that eager salesperson jumps on it, opens it, and now they've opened the door into the network.
Thanks, Bob. So let me pick up on the general topic of insider threats. It's a huge topic. If you look at the Verizon data breach report, something like 2 in 3 incidents that are classed as insider threat are not system or security process related. They're very much down to the very fallible human being. Everything from pulling out the input power cord or network cable to losing data and losing files, shipping information to the wrong place. A great exhibit was announced in the press today that Lenovo staff in Asia, all of their staff information has been breached because someone had a copy of the HR information on an unencrypted laptop. It's not just a focus of security technology and computer systems. There's a lot of people-related prevention and management that needs to be part of your security posture. Talking about security posture, it's really important these days to make sure that you have nominated staff and teams ready to go, assuming a breach will happen and your organizational readiness is going to be measured. Moody's, for example, last month said that they're going to provide information about the perceived readiness of organizations, which is going to convert into business risk information, which is an interesting way to push things forward. Everybody says we need to be better prepared, but actually being measured and scored on it does tend to get the attention of the board. As Bob mentioned already, the time to respond is reducing quite dramatically. Again, coming back to EU's GDPR, once you've identified a breach has happened, you have a very fast clock ticking down to get you to the point where you're providing enough information to explain what has happened how some of these breaches can be prevented, what your organization's posture is going to be, and what some short-term remediation, like providing credit checking for affected customers or suppliers. You have to get this to the regulators in multiple geographies within a very short period of time, whereas in the past you may have had 28 or maybe even 36 days to get yourself ready. The EU regulations, amongst others, don't let you have more than a few days, and you need to be ready. So you almost need to have a framework of a response that's going to go out to your regulator or go out to the data protection registrars in particular countries, good to go, and then just update and fill in the gaps. So your organization understands and has pre-agreed what your posture is going to be, needs to be signed off by your board, and it needs to get out into the public sphere very, very quickly. Lastly, the world has become a lot more transparent. What has been hidden in the past has opened up quite significantly in the last year or so. Security organizations, government organizations that have waved dark shadows saying various international governments are a risk, but we can't explain why. That kimono has been opened quite significantly with North Korea, with Russia and China specifically, people being more explicit about the kinds of attacks that have happened. Organizations are at risk of losing your own intellectual property. There may not be a particular grudge with your organization specifically, but your vertical and your market in your region where you operate may be a target, and it may be in some other country's interest to suppress your business or to make it impossible for you to do business across international regions or into specific countries. So state-based attacks and threats are being articulated more clearly, and I would expect the Verizon Data Breach Report to pick up on this a lot more clearly over when the next report comes through in Q1 or Q2 next year. Back to Bob to talk a little bit about the devices that we all live with on a personal basis, either in our hands, on the furniture in our houses, or actually looking at our baby children. So Bob, back to you.
Sure. So mobile and IoT, Internet of Things, malware continue to have increasing issues. And with the proliferation of devices, device types, and everything else out there, malware actors are always looking for that new way to compromise you. Windows malware volumes, of course, continue to outpace all of the others, but these users of mobile devices, which these days is most of us, are increasingly victims of malicious activity, either on our phones or our tablets. And everybody wonders why is the case? Why do they want to infect my phone? People are using these devices to protect some of their most sensitive information. Password lists, financial account site login information, even your SMS messages or your photos and video images, not to mention everything that you're doing on your social media accounts and some of us that have multi-factor authentication apps. People might wonder, why do you care what I'm sending in my SMS or that I have in my photo library? One of the things you may hear about more and more often these days is called sextortion. So I'm going to contact David and say, hey, I've got proof that you visited X nasty website, or I got this photo off your phone, and if you don't pay me, I'm going to release it out to your company or out to your family or just out to the public in general. And even if you didn't do it, I'm thinking I didn't do any of that stuff. So, where are they coming from? I'm going to click on that link and see who it really is, or click on it and tell them forget it. As soon as you click that link, sometimes they don't have anything. They just want you to click the link, and they're going to infect you from the link instead. So it's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem out there. And honestly, they're even using it to coin mine. You don't get a lot of processing power, but my phone's got a lot more power than my laptop had 5 years ago. And with millions of devices, that little bit of power still equates to a very large operation when you can tie them all together. And third-party app stores have traditionally been a major source of distribution for these malicious applications. Popular applications that have Trojans inserted into them are then stuck out there on these other non-standard app stores, and then people download them and it gets onto their devices. So reminding your users to stay away from non-sanctioned app stores. And if you do have mobile device management in your company, that kind of software in place, making sure to add proper restrictions to keep people away from some of these places. Apple and Android Play Stores, of course, do have closed ecosystems, and they do some level of vetting of the developers and scanning of those applications, but that's not always enough to protect you from harm. Some of these infection creators, as they're looking for new ways to get their software on their device, sometimes a little bad code gets through the screening. They just don't catch everything right away. And other times apps do look legitimate to the scanners because they don't really contain the bad stuff. They're just pointing you to it. So an Android app that could seem to be something, prevalent and something good out there, it's really just taking and it is directing you back to a second tier website, and that website instead is harvesting whatever data you could be convinced to enter. So as far as the application scanners look, nothing's wrong because there's really nothing in there. There's some logos and a couple of web links. It's those web links that actually take you to a phishing site or take you to a site where they can harvest that data from you. And beyond those mobile systems, of course, the interconnected world of everything is increasingly becoming a problem, as well as a solution to some of the things out there. The Internet of Things is comprised of millions of devices. They're in thousands of form factors. They range from your router to your security cameras to your new smart car. And many of these devices, they're running Linux operating systems or other really stripped down operating systems. And as manufacturers are driving to be faster to market and cheaper in price, security is often an afterthought to them. And botnet writers have turned their attention to these devices. And there's not as many headlines these days as there were a while back, but those actors have not moved on the way that the news programs have. Compromised devices are being used for everything.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, we're often buying our own mobile phone or cell phone these days ourselves and just buying a SIM card. Whereas in the past, the device would have gone through some certification from your cellular provider, and they'd understand the configuration that goes out to the consumer. Very often, and I'm certainly one of those. I buy my own phone, I buy my own tablet, and just buy a SIM card to plug in. There's no centralized control. Maybe an application is targeted and is breached even in a certified store. That application is blocked and you can't download it again, but there's no automatic delete process on devices that you own that has no centralized management on them. So it's an ongoing concern, how to remediate and fix that, how to get yourself clean again, short of a full device reset is going to be an ongoing problem.
And SIM swapping is even becoming a fairly large issue. So I want to get access to your phone, and the way I can do that is by getting a copy of the information on your SIM card on my phone. And now suddenly I own your accounts, I own your password reset messages and everything else. And that's either being done by tricking phone store employees, going in and saying, hey, I just bought a new device, or I lost my device, I dropped it in the lake or whatever. I need you to get my SIM card and plug it into this new one I have in my hands. And many times they're even getting store employees to help them. So malicious actors are kicking back to an employee over at the Verizon store and getting them to change somebody's data. I don't want to knock on Verizon, it was just an example, but they're using those employees to actually help them get those SIM card swaps done. And now when I get into your bank and I hit the password reset button, it comes to my phone, and now I can reset the password to anything I want, and now I've taken over those accounts. It is good to mention too that some of this stuff is happening in firmware. People are compromising the supply chain process, inserting malicious code right from the start. And sometimes you can clean your device by just doing a reset and a reboot. It's just going to be a matter of time until that same thing generally is just recompromised on you again. Many times the real solution is you have to upgrade your firmware. You have to make sure you're changing default credentials so that the admin/password is not your password forever. And of course, sometimes it actually requires you replacing those compromised devices because there's no good way to fix them, and you're just going to have to get something better.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. So let me talk about this wonderful world of cloud computing. The public cloud services have been available now for more than 14 years, and things have moved on from uptimes and downtimes in particular data centers, in particular geographies and cloud zones. The way we use cloud has become much more sophisticated. I think recent surveys have said that more than 95% of all organizations who are in some kind of business or providing service are having a mix of in-house and cloud-based, hybrid cloud is now a fact of life. We're becoming much more dependent on some of the services and operational practices of these cloud vendors. Here are 3 examples. The first one is the Azure service. Because of some of the requirements in some verticals in North America specifically, are now spreading into Europe and Asia. Logging into systems with passwords is no longer appropriate, and in some verticals is actually specifically banned. So Microsoft had a bit of a serious down day in November where trying to log in with their strong authentication tokens, however that whichever token type you chose, whether it was a face or a fingerprint or something else, was completely offline for 14 hours, effectively 2 elapsed shifts worth of time through the day, or 1 effective full working day. A lot of this affected Office 365 users in verticals where MFA was absolutely required. The issue they found was not just the technical failure, but they had no way to report and to be able to analyze what the problem was. You can see the quote here. You just couldn't work out what the root causes of the problem were. As a result, Microsoft is busily retooling a huge chunk of their alerting and monitoring systems so they can get the information they need to support what is now effectively a 4 or 5 9 authentication service. It's a little bit different from just a system being up or down. System being up but not accessible for critical customers in particular verticals is not acceptable. Of course, there's been an ongoing story with S3 configuration buckets. Over the last 4 or 5 years, inappropriate configuration of the security sessions of the S3 buckets themselves. There's been no way to manage that centrally, and there's been a whole ecosystem of AWS partners who've made really good business out of alerting and monitoring and retesting and rechecking the ACL settings of all the S3 buckets that your organization may use across various geographies. Finally, Amazon have come to a resolution of this. They're providing a method to set a minimum set of ACL controls that, however your support staff may wish to, they can't reduce. They can only get stronger and they can't get worse than. So in short term, this may kill a certain amount of cybersecurity service provision by the ecosystem. But I think from a consumer of S3 services, this makes a lot of sense. Certainly from a centralized control perspective, this is something an auditor is going to expect to see. So this is really good news. Finally, a very different type of constraint was Google Cloud in the summer. They started shutting down and disconnecting people's running production systems. Some automation and AI was looking for what they flagged as suspicious behavior, and the AI itself was shutting down production systems, and even worse, disconnecting the billing service for that service. So you had to go through a complete recycle of the get to know the customer, providing a government issued ID. And God forbid that the credit card that was used, the chief financial officer's credit card, was the one that's providing the money to pay for this service. If that executive happened to be on a business trip internationally or was on vacation, there was a 3 elapsed day time limit. Otherwise, this information would have been deleted. So it was a massive amount of scrabbling, a huge amount of business operation, and a massive brand failure for Google. So this is something that they have vowed to resolve and to actually put people back into the assessment of the suspicious activities and to have people available rather than just automation and recovery processes driven by technology to put a person back into the customer relationship again. So things have moved on quite a bit from just data centers being up and down. Different types of services have new expectations, the way we use them. If hybrid computing is now part of our life going forward, then all the services that are offered by these cloud vendors needs to be stepped up, and it needs to be made production ready in multiple time zones, and the recovery and review needs to be done in a very transparent way. We're starting to see that, but we'll still expect the other shoe to drop in with various instances through the next year. Bob, let's keep going on the cloud story and talk about cloud security responsibility.
Thanks, David. Your last slide gave me a perfect opportunity to talk for a minute about cloud security. Insecure cloud resources were a huge source of problems in 2018. We expect them to continue to be a huge problem in 2019. And hopefully everybody who's using any kind of cloud resources has heard of the shared security or shared responsibility model. Personally, I take every chance I get to remind people about it because of the big amount of issues that we've seen out there. Because cloud security and compliance really still includes everything a security team is normally responsible for. It's really just located in the cloud now. So all of your traditional controls remain, but who's responsible for implementing what is what really changes as you migrate systems up into the cloud. So overall, the scope of your security and compliance really doesn't change. You just need to understand who is in charge of what. And that's commonly referred to as the shared responsibility model. And really what that is a matrix depending on your cloud provider, what features you're using, or what deployment model you've selected. And at a high level, it really maps what degree of responsibility applies to which entities, depending on what technology is being used. So the most important thing about this model is understanding exactly who is responsible for what. What part is your cloud provider responsible? What part are you responsible for? And you can kind of see as we go from left to right across this screen, depending on what you're deploying, the degree of responsibility is changing. So infrastructure as a service, I'm just spinning up bare metal systems up in Azure or AWS. That's mostly on me at that point. I get my OS, I'm responsible for patching, I'm responsible for updating, I'm responsible for security. Whereas we go to more over on the right, I'm provisioning into an existing provider. So think of Salesforce or other big software as a service solutions. I'm now going into their network and I have to assume that they have the proper security controls. So if you are doing that type of service, it's really important for you to get a copy of what the controls actually are. Make sure that your SaaS provider is doing the requisite things to protect your information and the things that you need inside of their environments. And that security compliance really is a shared responsibility between the providers and those end users. So this screen has a lot of blocks on it showing different places and different things that people are responsible for. The biggest area where we saw a continual stream of issues last year was in that top section. Data stores that are continuing to be exposed with missing or insecure credentials, access methods that are not properly vetted, and that allows for malicious people to get unauthorized access to the data behind them, or simply management panes that are left open to compromise. So I can get into your management control system. I can now get into everything in your cloud environment. So we want to be sure that we are being careful about where we can manage our cloud resources from. It should honestly be from dedicated workstations that are meant only to manage cloud resources. You shouldn't have all of your standard day-to-day software on those systems because you really want to protect the access to those things. There's lots of companies that offer solutions that can help you get better visibility, of course, into those security things. Help Systems is, of course, one. Other cloud providers are starting to offer solutions like AWS and the S3 thing that David just talked about. We want to make sure that we are taking advantage of these controls that are being offered and make sure that we can get the best protection that we can for those assets we deploy up into the cloud.
Thank you. So let's move forward into some of the things that might hit us all next year. Again, this is not so much technology, but more about people, process, and organization, I think, in the main. So let me pick up with the first one, just as an example. There's been much wider deployment of data protection regulations worldwide. Obviously, the focus last year was, or this year, was on the implementation of EU's GDPR. There are 31 other national data protection regulations. What's interesting in North America and in the US specifically is states are getting involved. Obviously, the number of residents in California are larger than many countries around the world. And the Californian regulation, the CCPA, went through their state government very, very rapidly to meet a particular government organizational deadline. And maybe the regulations themselves were enacted a little swiftly. They might end up getting remediated and changed. but very much reflecting the personal responsibility for your own information. Now Californian residents can take ownership, can ask organizations to tell them about what data they have on them, and maintain and express ownership. So you get to choose, not the organization that's holding and processing your data. You have the choice about how that data is held and how it is changed. There must be processes in place to update and change that data. And if there's a dispute between you and the data holder or provider, then there needs to be a formal process for this. And many states' regulations, just like California, have a specific requirement to make sure the systems are protected from theft. So this is the situation I talked about with the retailer in the UK. Your external presence through the web, your interconnection between you and your business partners may be secure, but if one of your employees or contractors working in your data center can walk off with personal identifiable information, that's completely just not allowed. This means the implementation of encryption, encrypting personalized information, maybe even including personal names and address information, not just financial information, or maybe replacing the personal ID and creating what they call tokens. So tokenization of personal data and some reference to another system that your data center staff don't have access to. So if the information is removed, it can't be identified to an individual person. What's interesting with specifically California is there's a lot of preparation that's going to have to be put in place. And based on our experience from GDPR, the analysis and the initial business process changes themselves are probably going to take about 12 months at a minimum. So if you have North American customers, suppliers, or partners in your system, regardless of where in the world you are, you really need to have a new project it started, just like GDPR was started in various organizations around the world. If you are specifically a North American organization who avoided GDPR by cutting off your European customer base, as happened with many media companies. So for example, I couldn't get a service from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times for a while because they just wanted to separate themselves from the regulation environment in Europe. Then you are not going to be ready. You haven't implemented some of these processes. And it's going to take a significant amount of time to get even the basic semi-manual processes in place. And it's going to require significant headcount. So if you don't have a project defined to look after your North American customer base, then you better get moving pretty quickly. And the same thing for other regulations, similar types of regulations around the world. Next, an interesting piece of news from Australia. Over the last few days, for the first time, a Western government in almost 3.5 decades has mandated that data being processed that's protected by encryption and security. If you get a warrant from a government agency in Australia, then that data must be accessible somehow. And that's going to be a challenge because most of our modern computing infrastructure has encryption built in many cases end-to-end encryption. And the current architectures of the systems that are built for security in mind just don't have backdoors enabled in them. And to actually re-architect those systems is going to take significant effort. So this regulation has passed the Australian both houses just in the past few days. And you're going to see a huge wave of especially international companies, many web companies like Twitter and Facebook and many, many others making representations to the Australian government to say what they're asking for and demanding and is now law just isn't feasible and certainly can't be delivered in a short term. What's interesting as a UK citizen is, of course, Australia is a member of what they call the Five Eyes countries. If your data transfers or goes through systems or is accessible from systems in Australia as a UK citizen, then maybe someone could pass a warrant to get access to my information via a channel in Australia. And then that information could be shared between the security departments of Australia and, say, for example, the UK. theoretically, the agreements, the Five Eyes agreements, would allow them to do that. Because the door has been opened in one country, potentially that door could be opened in all five, or it may be used as a legal basis to enact similar legislation in the USA, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. So it's a very interesting prospect. I've been working in cybersecurity for more than 30 years, and this feels very much like why some of the security software and families of software that were created in the early 1980s, why they were created in the first place, was to bypass and avoid this kind of situation. So it's going to be a very frisky 2019, specifically around this issue. And we'll see where this goes and where the balance between what's technically feasible with what's implemented in real production systems and what government agencies are going to start demanding from us all. Bob, let's talk a little bit about cybersecurity vendors.
Sure, David. So there's two types of vendor consolidation that I'd like to talk about, and we expect to see more and more of this happening in 2019. And number one is industry consolidation with mergers and acquisitions. And we're not going to go through a big list of all the ones that happened in 2018, but let's talk a bit about some of the reasons that we're seeing this trend continue to escalate. There's really big demand in the market these days for cybersecurity and cybersecurity software. So the global cybersecurity market is continuing to grow, and we expect it to rise above 150 billion by 2023. And that translates into a really big growth rate of over 10%. And because this demand for the products is so high, cybersecurity firms have a big valuation rate relative to their earnings. And that's led to a lot of venture capital being invested, billions of dollars over the course of 2018 to buy up these different companies and merge them together. And as long as there's money needing a place to go, of course, there's going to be a continued appetite from all of these firms trying to find places to put that money and things to invest it in. And the other type of consolidation that we're seeing out there, and we expect more and more of this to happen as well in 2019, is consolidation from that end user or consumer side. And that's helping to drive, of course, some of those mergers and acquisitions. And what's going on is that security consumers are realizing that they just have too many individual vendors to manage. You know, they want that one throat to choke. And having all of those different vendors for these different point solutions in those big environments is increasing their costs, it's increasing the complexity of the environment. And they're looking for people to offer more of a single solution instead of a lot of these little point solutions. So they're looking for these integrated suites where one company can provide more of the pieces and the parts that they need. Larger vendors also, of course, then generally have those better support options. They've got services teams to speed of implementations. And when required, some of them can even offload monitoring and remediation to help with shortage of those trained security professionals. So this is definitely a trend that we saw growing in 2018. And as long as the economy holds good, we expect to see a lot more of it continuing in 2019.
Yeah, this is definitely something that marries the replacement of infrastructure, either with new systems in your own data centers or moving to the cloud. When people make technology or infrastructure change, it's certainly an opportunity to seriously have a look at your existing relationships, and certainly in the cyberspace, thinking about updating to the latest tools so that can last your new infrastructure for 5 to 7 years. So just as infrastructure itself changes, the cyber footprint and the sheer number of suppliers that are out there, consolidating that opportunity is happening right now. So let's talk a little bit more and push on the reduced timeline for responses to breaches and some thoughts about prevention. Bob?
Yeah, better, faster, and cheaper. That's always everybody's mantra, right? And you could have it good, fast, or cheap. Pick two. You know, we're always looking for better ways to get in front of the issues inside of our environments. Last year, $3.6 million was about the average cost of a breach, and that equated to around $150 per stolen data record. So the sooner we can find and kill off an infection, of course, the more money we can save for our organization. And security software is increasingly integrating things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to get a better understanding of the differences between normal and abnormal behaviors. So maybe I don't see an infection by the hash code on the infection software, software, I see a breach by the way David's acting, because David doesn't usually log in at noon on a Central Time Tuesday. He's asleep at that point. So if I see that access happening, I understand that it's different than normal, and now I can recognize that. That's going to gain valuable time for our security analysts and our network teams, increasingly using SIM solutions, security information and event management solutions, to detect and correlate the issues from across the environment. So a user being created on system A and then being used on system B equates to a possible compromise and an indicator of attack. So we want to make sure that we can, as quickly as possible, use malware detection, use SIM solutions to get in front of all of these things, not just on our PCs, as we talked about, IoT systems, mobile systems, and all of our backend servers as well. Malware writers, of course, are also getting into the game. So we have that back and forth battle always. So as we're getting better at improving our defenses, doing a better job of detecting things that's happening inside of our systems, the malware and malicious actor writers, of course, are also beginning to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning into their systems so that they can find a better way to compromise and attack all of us.
That's great. So the last area that we talk about is, again, more of a people issue and not so much a quick fix by the application of new tools and technology. And this is very much around people, and Bob and I will both have things to say about this. This has been an ongoing trend that is really not improving. As we all know, we're having to implement more policy, more cybersecurity. We have to test more. We have to get more past auditors. And the staffing in the cybersecurity space is now pretty much at a screaming crisis. Here are some headlines from the year through various channels. Forbes, TechTarget is a big channel for all kinds of webinars and services. So TechTarget themselves reviewed the messaging that was coming forward. And then Cybersecurity Ventures did an interesting survey in the summer and made a forecast that worldwide we're short 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs, that's heads, by 2021, in effectively now 3 years' time. So what we're saying is buying a new tool may not be the only way and the only way to get ourselves out of this problem. We have a fundamental problem in our business and the way we run our operations. There are just enough not cybersecurity trained people. And as per the TechTarget quote, the cybersecurity professionals that we use today, their skills become out of date very, very quickly. Some of the things that we worried about last year, the trends change, and the cybersecurity staff consultants that we use today may not be the appropriate people. They may not have the right training in a year or two's time to handle tomorrow's problem. So it's a combination of factors of headcount and people. Interestingly, in a radio presentation I made in the middle of the year in Chicago, I was asked a question about what do we do about the future? And my immediate response was, if you have a teenager who's looking to go to university and they're thinking about what kind of career they want, then the cybersecurity business is certainly a career that's going to keep people going for multiple decades going forward. Bob, what's your thoughts?
A lot of people are chalking it up to maybe government bureaucracy is not keeping up with the times. Others say business leaders just really underestimated the explosive growth of cybercrime and what it was going to do to everybody. And thus, the number changes a little bit depending on what report you read, but really the scale of the problem stays fairly consistent. There's a lot of new ideas being taken now to try and help bridge that gap. Businesses are definitely investing a lot more in professional development and training. So bring those individuals you already have in your organization into those positions that you need, and give them the skills that they need to do those jobs for you. It's a really good retention tool. Employees feel empowered. They have a new career path. And a lot of times it's just easier to take someone who's familiar with your environment and give them those new skills. There's also changes happening with HR in the hiring and recruiting process. Many times HR would look at that didn't check the box or for your college degree, you automatically go into I don't really care about you that much pile. And they're starting to realize that there's a big untapped potential of people out there that either are self-trained or have less than a 4-year degree, and they really are more and more starting to look at those different classes of employees trying to come in. They're also using some, fairly novel recruiting tactics. I know of some companies that'll maybe send all their engineers out to a big security conference. They'll swag them all up, and HR goes right along with them and takes a conference room. And as soon as you meet somebody who might be a good potential, walk them into that HR room and let's talk right now and see if we can bring you over to our organization.
Yeah, there's definitely a change. With many different types of breaches being people and the way people behave, the idea of a cybersecurity professional being, a security geek, where there's lots more interaction. So in many organizations, they're hiring psychologists and social engineers as part of their cybersecurity practice, because if 2 in 3 breaches are actually people and the way people behave, not the technology and tools and the systems that are running your business, then what a cybersecurity person is going forward is going to have to significantly change going into the future. So certainly more opportunities for young people with different technology sets, with different social skill sets and different kinds of personalities. The caricature of a cybersecurity geek is now probably dead. There's probably 7 or 8 or 9 different flavors of someone looking after your system cybersecurity, but also the social engineering side, making sure your staff and your human beings are ready to protect themselves and to protect your organization.
Yeah, David, and much more often now we're also seeing businesses are joining into social networking groups, whether they be meetup groups or online things or just monthly meetings where we're all going to get together and chat about what our problems and solutions are. And generally in the past that didn't happen that much because everybody was so guarded about letting somebody know too much information about how their processes might be working or what software they might be using for their malware protection, because they didn't want to give an avenue of attack to anybody. And really now they're starting to see that need to meet more people in those industries and give them a better avenue of recruitment is starting to outweigh those other concerns. And it's getting to be a much more open society, at least in the regional environments.
Okay, so we're coming up to the hour. As this session has been going on, we've only had one real question that I can answer straight away. We've got a couple of others. We'll answer them on an individual basis. There are people asking specific questions about topics related to their business. One person asked where we got some of this business data and the statistics. The answer is from many sources. We look at analyst reports, general business analyst reports, and cybersecurity analyst reports. I've talked about the Verizon database report, the big analysts like Gartner and EMA, and the others around the world, very much on a worldwide basis rather than just focusing on US analysts. So a lot of this data is aggregated from multiple sources. We will, of course, like our other webinars, this recording will be saved and will be posted on various social media platforms. If you have any other questions, please contact us. Our contact information is on our website. Happy to provide more information or more detail if necessary, or where we got some of our references from. So I'd like to thank you all for spending an hour, which is quite a lot of time these days in the busy world that we're in, and my co-presenter, Bob. And I hope to speak and hear from you again through 2019. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful festive period. Thank you.